The smell of the dungeon reached me before I even descended the first stone step. It was not merely the cold, though the cold was there, biting through the thin wool of my cloak like a blade with no handle, pressing itself against my skin until I could feel each individual bone in my fingers. No. It was something deeper than cold, something older. The smell of iron and wet stone and something faintly animal, like a wolf that had been left too long in the rain, cornered somewhere it never meant to be. I had been in the castle's lower passages many times, carrying broth to sick servants, fetching herbs from the root cellar, slipping through shadows the way Omegas learn to move almost from birth, but I had never descended this far. This was the place that had no name in polite conversation. Servants called it the Deep and looked away when they said it. My name is Ellie, and I had no business being there. That was the first thought that ran through my mind as I pressed my back against the damp corridor wall, clutching the small clay pot of salve I had prepared that morning, calendula, yarrow, ground willow bark, my hands trembling not entirely from the cold. I had no rank, no authority, no reason the guards above should have let me pass. But they had. Old Bram, who had watched me carry medicines through these halls for 3 winters, had looked at the clay pot in my hands and then at my face, and something in his tired eyes had shifted. "Don't stay long," he had said. That was all. I took it as permission. I took everything small as permission, because large permissions were never given to me. The torches in the lower corridor were spaced far apart, and between them the darkness pooled like standing water. I moved through it carefully, counting the iron doors as I passed, 1, 2, 3, until I reached the 4th, which was the only one with light visible beneath it. Not warm light. A sickly, guttering thing, as if the torch inside had been burning too long without being changed. I pressed my palm flat against the door. The wood was cold enough to ache. I should have turned back. Every sensible instinct I had cultivated across 23 years of survival told me to turn back. I did not turn back. The door was not locked. That, above all things, told me what the lords of this castle thought of the man inside. That he was already so broken, so finished, that a lock was a courtesy they no longer owed him. I pushed it open. He was chained to the far wall. Not sitting, not crouched. He was held upright by the chains themselves, thick iron links attached to rings driven deep into the stone. His arms spread at his sides in a posture that was almost cruel in its deliberateness, as though whoever had designed this had wanted him to look like a defeated thing on display. His head was bowed, dark braids falling forward over his face, and for one lurching moment, I thought I had come too late. That the thing Bram had quietly, wordlessly communicated to me with his tired eyes, "Go see, girl, do what you do," had already passed its window. Then he breathed. It was a slow, labored breath, the kind that cost something, but it was breath. I crossed the cell in 6 steps and crouched to set my clay pot on the floor. Up close, the damage was plain, and I made myself look at it without flinching, the way my old teacher Marin had taught me. See it first as a healer, feel it after as a person, never the other way around. Lacerations across both forearms where the chains had bitten through skin. A bruise across his jaw that had gone the color of old plums. His leather armor had been stripped from him, leaving only the rough linen beneath, which was torn at the shoulder. He was large, far larger than I had expected, even having heard the stories, even having seen him once from across the great hall, distant and untouchable on the dais, a figure around whom the very air seemed to tighten. Alpha King Roman of Vaelthorn did not look like a king right now. He looked like a man who had been left to disappear quietly, so that no one would have to answer for it. I opened the clay pot and reached for his nearest wrist. His head came up. Those eyes, and I had not been prepared for them. Not truly, despite the whispers, despite what I had seen from a distance, were a pale, startling gray-blue, like the sky at the precise moment before a storm makes its decision. They fixed on me with an intensity that pinned me to the spot more firmly than any chain could have, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. His breathing had changed, sharper, measuring. "Who?" he said, and his voice was rough with disuse, dragged up from somewhere deep and cracked. "Are you?" Not a question. A demand, even now. Even like this. I swallowed. "Ellie," I said. I helped the healer, Marin's apprentice." A pause. "She's unwell. She sent what she could." It was not entirely true. Marin had not sent me. Marin did not know I was here. But I had learned, also from Marin, that a partial truth offered kindly is sometimes more merciful than a full truth offered badly. He watched me for a long moment. Something moved behind those gray eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Nothing so simple. But a recalibration. An assessment being revised. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know." I reached for his wrist again, more steadily this time. "Hold still." He said nothing more. But he did not pull away, which, given that he was a man who could have broken the chains if he had had a fraction of his full strength, and perhaps even now could have tried, felt like something significant. Like a choice made from a place I didn't yet understand. I worked in silence for a time, applying the salve to the raw skin where iron had scraped deepest. The torchlight threw our shadows large against the wall, mine small and hunched and careful, his immense and still. The dungeon smelled of old metal and damp and now, faintly, of the herbs in my mixture, calendula, dry and sweet and strange in that airless place. After a while, without lifting his head fully, he said, "They will come back in the morning." "I know," I said again. "They mean to finish it quietly. Blame it on the chains." I didn't answer immediately. I moved to the second wrist. The skin there was worse. I made myself breathe evenly. "How many of the council?" I asked. A pause, as if he was surprised I had asked a strategic question rather than a frightened one. 4, perhaps 5. Lord Kayed is the architect of it." Lord Kayed, I knew the name. Everyone in the castle knew the name. The way you know the name of a cold wind that comes from a particular direction, that you recognize before it arrives by the way the animals go quiet. "There's a passage," I said, keeping my voice level. "Behind the east grain cellar. The servants use it in winter when the main corridors ice over. It opens onto the outer wall near the stables." I looked up at him then, directly, for the first time holding his gaze rather than glancing away from it. If the chains were not an obstacle, if someone were to bring a key. The gray eyes did not widen, but something in them sharpened, almost imperceptibly, like a blade being drawn a single inch from its scabbard. "You," he said slowly, "are not what I expected." "No one expects much from an Omega," I said, and I meant it without bitterness, or mostly without it. That's occasionally useful. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had weight in it. Possibility. The kind of quiet that settles between two people who have just, without quite meaning to, made a decision together. I closed the clay pot and rose to my feet, wrapping my cloak around me against the cold. "I'll come back before dawn," I said. I had turned toward the door when his voice reached me one last time. Still rough, still stripped of any courtly softness, but carrying something I had not heard in it before. "Ellie." I stopped. "Why?" I considered a dozen answers. I discarded all of them because they were either too small or too large. I settled, finally, on the one that was simply true. "Because no one should be left to disappear quietly," I said. "Not even a king." I did not wait to see his expression. I slipped back into the dark corridor and moved silently upward through the cold. Heart hammering, mind already turning. already counting hours and guards and the weight of what I had just set in motion. I had 3 hours until dawn, and I had never, in my entire life, done anything that could not be undone. The key was the first problem. I had spoken with a confidence in that dungeon cell that I did not fully possess, and as I climbed back through the castle's dark passages, my mind was already pulling apart every thread of what I had promised. A key, a passage, a man in chains who weighed twice what I did and could barely draw a full breath. 3 hours until the gray light of dawn crept over the eastern towers, and Lord Cad's men descended those stone steps to do what powerful men do when they want something to simply cease to exist. I pressed myself into an alcove near the upper corridor and closed my eyes for a moment, forcing myself to think clearly rather than quickly. Panic was a luxury I had learned early not to indulge. When you are an omega in a castle full of alphas and betas, when you are the lowest rank in a hierarchy as old as the stones themselves, panic is the one thing that will destroy you faster than any enemy. Think, Ellie. Think like Marin taught you. What do you have? What can you reach? The dungeon keys were kept on a ring at the guard post at the top of the lower stairs. I had seen them there every time I passed. Heavy iron, 3 of them, hanging from a hook beside the torch bracket. Old Bram held them during his watch. Bram, who had let me pass tonight with nothing but a look. Bram, who had been a servant in this castle for 40 years, and had, I knew from long conversations over shared meals in the servants' hall, no love for Lord Caid, or the faction that had been quietly reshaping the council since midsummer. I did not think Bram would hand me the keys if I asked directly, but I thought, and this was the kind of thin, careful calculation that Omega life sharpens in a person, that Bram might set them down somewhere reachable if I gave him a reason to look somewhere else. I found him exactly where I had left him, seated on the low stool at the guard post, a tallow candle burning beside him, a cup of something warm steaming in his hands. He was a square, gray-haired man with a face like weathered bark, and when he saw me reappear from the lower passage, he said nothing at first. Just watched me over the rim of his cup with those careful old eyes. "He's alive," I said quietly. "For now." Bram set his cup down. "There's a sound," I continued, keeping my voice even, "from the third door in the lower east passage. Scratching. Could be rats. Could be something in the wall." I paused. "You should check it before you make your report to the morning watch." A long silence. The candle flame bent sideways without any wind to explain it. Then Bram stood, picked up his torch, and walked toward the lower passage. He did not look at the key ring. He did not look at me. He left a gap of perhaps 4 feet between himself and the hook on the wall. I did not waste it. The east grain cellar was 3 levels up and across the width of the castle's inner ward, and I had to move through it, carrying not only the keys, but the clay pot, my cloak, and a second bundle I had collected from Marin's stores on the way. Strips of clean linen for binding, a small vial of the stronger willow bark tincture, a piece of hard bread and dried meat wrapped in cloth. Because whatever came next, the King of Vaelthorn had clearly not been fed properly in days, and a man cannot walk far on an empty body. I also took one of Marin's spare cloaks. Plain, undyed wool. Servant's dress. The kind of thing that makes a person invisible. By the time I descended again into the deep corridor, the castle above me was beginning its first slow stirrings, the distant clatter of the kitchen fires being stoked, the faint sound of boots on flagstone somewhere far overhead. Time was contracting. He heard me before I reached the door. I know this because when I pushed it open, he had already lifted his head, and his eyes found me in the doorway immediately, without searching. I held up the key ring. Something moved through his expression that was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but sat somewhere between them, complicated and carefully controlled, the expression of a man who has learned not to show what hope costs him. "Can you stand?" I asked, crossing to him. "Yes." He said it with absolute certainty. I was not entirely sure I believed him, but this was not the moment to debate it. The lock on the left chain was stiff, and I had to work it with both hands, feeling the mechanism grind reluctantly before it gave. When the chain released his left arm, Roman brought it forward slowly, not dramatically, not with any visible show of pain, though I could see in the rigid set of his jaw exactly how much it cost him. He was a man who wore his control like armor, layered over whatever lay beneath. The second chain was easier. When both arms were free, he stood unsupported for the first time, and I instinctively stepped closer, not to catch him exactly, but to be within reach. He was steady, barely, at the margins of it, but steady. I held out the plain cloak. He looked at it, then at me. "Servant's dress," he said. "The most powerful camouflage in any castle." I said, "No one looks at a servant." A beat of silence. Then, without further comment, he took the cloak and pulled it around his shoulders. The effect was imperfect. He was simply too large, too present, too much. But in bad light, and with his braids tucked beneath the hood, it was possible, barely, to believe he was something other than what he was. I handed him the food without ceremony. He ate it in 3 efficient bites, the way soldiers eat when they have learned not to be precious about meals, and I found myself watching his face for a moment before I remembered to look away. "The passage narrows about halfway through," I said, turning toward the door. "You'll have to move sideways. There are 2 places where the ceiling drops. After that it opens into the cellar, and from the cellar there's a door to the outer ward." I paused. "The stables are on the left. There will be 1 stable hand asleep in the loft. A boy named Pip. He's young and sleeps heavily. He won't hear us if we're quiet." "Us," Roman said. I glanced back. He was watching me with that gray-eyed steadiness that I was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things. Direct, without decoration. "I know the passage," I said. "You don't. You understand what happens if we're seen. I understand what happens to you if you stay." I met his gaze. "I'll take my chances on the other side of that." He held my eyes for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and I had the unsteady sensation of being measured against some internal standard I couldn't see and didn't know the shape of. Then he gave a single, slow nod. Not dismissal. Something closer to acknowledgement. We moved. The passage was exactly as I remembered. Close and cold, smelling of earth and old grain. The ceiling pressing lower in 2 places, until Roman had to bend nearly double to clear it without sound. He made no complaint. He moved with a quietness that surprised me given his size, placing each foot with deliberate care, following the pressure of my hand when I reached back to signal a turn or a drop. There was one moment, midway through, when I stopped because I heard voices. Distant, above us, carried strangely through the stone. And we stood motionless in the dark for what felt like a very long time. I could hear his breathing just behind me, slow and controlled. I was acutely aware of how small the passage was, how close we stood, how the torchlight from my small hand candle threw everything into sharp relief and then snatched it back again. The voices moved away. We moved forward. The cellar opened around us like a held breath finally released, and beyond its heavy door the pre-dawn gray of the outer ward spread cold and quiet and open. The stable was where I said it would be. Pip was where I said he would be, curled in the loft with his mouth open, entirely oblivious. There were 3 horses in the stalls. Roman went to the largest without hesitation. A dark roan, broad-chested, who tossed its head once, and then went still when Roman put a hand to its neck and said something low that I didn't catch. I began to saddle it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. We let it out through the side gate, the one that the stable hands used for early morning watering, the one that was never guarded because why would it be? And then we were outside the walls, on the frost-pale road that ran north toward the tree line, and the sky was beginning to lighten along its lowest edge. Roman stopped and turned to look at the castle behind us, at the towers, the walls, the banners bearing the Vaelthorn wolf that still flew above the gate as though nothing had changed. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his stillness that felt immense, like a man taking the full measure of a wound before deciding what it means. Then he looked at me. "You could have left me there," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "No one would have blamed you. No one even knows you came." "No," I said. He looked at me for a long moment in the growing light. This man who was a king without a throne, who had been left to disappear quietly by men who believed they had already won. And I watched something shift in those gray eyes. Not gratitude exactly. Something weightier. Something that felt, unsteadily, like the beginning of a debt that had no clean shape yet. "Where does this road go?" he asked. "North," I said. "There's a village called Ashford, half a day's ride. An elder there, a woman named Corva. She owes Marin a kindness." I paused. "She'll shelter us. No questions." Roman turned back to the road, reached up and took the roan's reins. Then he held out his other hand to help me mount. I stared at it for a moment. That large, scarred hand extended toward me, the Lycan King offering assistance to an Omega servant as though it was the most natural thing in the world. I took it, and we rode north into the pale and trembling dawn, while behind us, somewhere deep in the castle's stone belly, someone was descending a staircase and reaching a door and finding a room with 2 broken chains and no king inside. Ashford was not much to look at. It crouched at the edge of the northern forest like something that had been meaning to leave for years and simply never found the moment. A cluster of low stone buildings, thatched roofs dark with old moss, a well at the center of a square that was more mud than cobblestone. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. A dog barked once from somewhere behind a fence, and then went quiet. The kind of village that exists in the spaces between important places, that appears on no lord's map because it produces nothing a lord would want. I had been here twice before, both times with Marin, and both times I had felt the particular relief of arriving somewhere that had no expectations of you. Corva met us at the edge of the village as though she had been expecting us, which perhaps she had. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60 or more winters, with white hair cut close to her head, and hands that were permanently ink-stained from the remedies she catalogued in her own cramped script. She was a healer of the old kind, trained before the guilds formalized everything, and she looked at Roman the way experienced healers look at serious wounds, without flinching, and with immediate calculation. "Marin's girl," she said to me, and then to Roman. "And you are larger than reported and in worse condition than I'd like. Come inside." Roman looked briefly as though he was going to assert something about his condition. Then he looked at Corva's expression and did not. The cottage had 2 rooms and a loft, and it smelled of dried rosemary and wood smoke and something faintly sweet that I could not immediately identify. Corva put Roman in the main room by the fire and set about her examination with the brisk efficiency of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by rank or size. Roman submitted to this with remarkable patience, though I noticed the way his jaw tightened when she pressed carefully along his ribs. "Too cracked," she said, without particular drama. "Not broken. You'll breathe shallowly for a fortnight and you won't like it. But you'll breathe." She glanced up at him. "What else?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My strength. The chains were treated. Some kind of compound on the iron." Corva's eyes sharpened. She looked at me. I understood immediately. She wanted to know if I had any knowledge of what had been used. I thought of the smell in the dungeon, beneath the iron and the damp. Something sharp and resinous. Something that had pricked at the back of my memory without fully surfacing. "Ash witherroot," I said slowly. "Possibly combined with something else. It suppresses the lichen bond. the connection between body and wolf nature. It's rare, very difficult to source. And very intentional, Corva said, and the words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Roman said nothing, but I saw his hands, resting on his knees, pressed slightly against the fabric of his breeches. A small, controlled movement, the kind that happens when a thought arrives that a person is not ready to say aloud yet. Someone had not merely imprisoned the Lycan King. Someone had specifically, knowledgeably, deliberately stripped him of what made him formidable. This was not opportunism. This was a plan that had been assembled over time by someone with access to rare knowledge and rarer materials. Lord Kayad, I thought. But Lord Kayad was a brutal man, not a subtle one. Brutal men did not know about Ashwither root. Brutal men had help. I did not say this yet, but I filed it carefully in the part of my mind where I kept things that needed to be returned to. Corva gave Roman the loft and gave me a pallet near the fire, and somewhere in what remained of the night, I slept. Not well, not deeply, but the kind of sleep that comes when a body has simply reached its limit and takes what it can get. I dreamed of the dungeon corridor, of torchlight and cold stone, and the strange, specific quality of silence in a place where someone has been left alone too long. I woke to gray morning light and the smell of barley porridge. Roman was already awake. He was seated at Corva's small table and spread before him. How he had found them, I did not know. Though Corva's cottage was the kind of place where things appeared when needed, were several sheets of rough parchment and a stick of charcoal. He was drawing something. Or rather, he was reconstructing something. The layout of the castle, I realized as I rose and moved closer, rendered from memory with a precision that was striking. Every corridor, every gate, every guard post I recognized. He did not look up when I approached, but he said, "You were right about Kayad. He did not act alone." I sat down across from him. Outside a wind had come up, and I could hear it moving through the thatch above us. "Who else?" I asked. "Lord Fenwick holds the eastern garrison. He has 300 men who answer to him before they answer to the crown." Roman's charcoal moved steadily across the parchment. "Kayad has the council. Fenwick has the swords. Together they have enough to hold the castle through a transition of power." A pause. Long enough, at least, to make my absence seem permanent. "And the rest of the council? The lords who didn't join them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Lord Aldrich of the North March. He is old and cautious, but not corrupt. He would not have consented to this. Lady Voss of the River Holdings. She commands respect and has no love for Kayad." Another pause, heavier than the last. "But they believe I am dead, or close enough to it. Without proof otherwise, they will not act against Kayad. They cannot afford the risk." I looked at the map he had drawn, at the castle rendered in charcoal lines on rough parchment, its corridors and towers and gates, all exactly where I knew them to be. And then I looked at the space outside the castle walls, the roads, the villages, the distances. "Aldrich is in the North March," I said slowly. "That is perhaps 2 days' hard ride from here." Roman looked up then, met my eyes. "You are suggesting I go to him?" "I am suggesting," I said carefully, "that a dead king who is not actually dead, arriving in person at the keep of a lord who is loyal but frightened, is a great deal more persuasive than a rumor, or a letter." I paused. "Aldrich needs to see you, alive, upright, not as something that can be ignored or disbelieved." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it, the texture of a person re-evaluating something they had already decided. Roman set down the charcoal. He looked at the map, and then past it, and I had the sense he was looking at something I couldn't see, some internal landscape where he was already moving pieces. "You have a strategic mind," he said, and it was not a compliment precisely. It was more like an observation made with faint surprise. the kind of surprise a person reveals before they can think to conceal it. "I've had a quiet life," I said. "Quiet lives make good observers." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, perhaps. The suggestion that somewhere beneath the weight he carried, the capacity for it still existed. We stayed 2 days in Ashford. Corva fed us and asked no questions, which was its own form of generosity. Roman slept more than I think he intended to. The Ashwither compound was still working its way out of his system, leaving him with a bone-deep exhaustion that he fought visibly and lost in the evenings, when I would look up from whatever task I had set myself and find him asleep in the chair by the fire, his head tipped back, his face in sleep carrying a stillness that was different from his waking stillness. Less controlled. More honest. I tried not to look for too long. During the days, we talked. It surprised me how much we talked. Or perhaps what surprised me was the quality of it. The way conversation moved between us, without the careful social engineering that characterized almost every exchange I had ever had in the castle. There, every word I spoke was measured against my rank, my usefulness, my invisibility. Here, in this small smoky cottage at the edge of the world, there was no architecture to navigate. He asked questions and listened to the answers. I asked questions, and he considered them seriously before he responded. I learned that Roman had taken the throne at 19, after his father's death in a border conflict that had been neither clean nor just. That he had spent the years since building alliances and enforcing laws that the previous reign had allowed to collapse into convenient flexibility. The kind of flexibility that benefits people like Lord Cad. That he had enemies not because he was cruel, but because he was not, which in a court of powerful men was its own form of threat. He learned that I had come to the castle at 17, brought by Marin who had known my mother. That my designation as Omega had been determined at 15, and had rearranged my life in ways both small and enormous. That I had taught myself to read from Marin's remedy books, because knowledge, I had decided early, was the one resource no one could take from you based on your rank. When I told him that last part, he was quiet for a moment. "No one taught you?" he asked. "Omegas aren't considered likely readers," I said. He looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for yet, something between anger and something gentler that I was not prepared to examine too closely. On the morning of the 3rd day, Corva appeared in the doorway while Roman was outside checking the roan and fixed me with those sharp eyes of hers. "He watches you," she said. Simply, without preamble, the way she delivered all significant information. "He watches everything," I said. "He's a king." Corva made a sound that suggested she found this response inadequate. "There is watching," she said, "and then there is watching. Learn the difference before you arrive somewhere you weren't expecting to be." I opened my mouth to answer, and she had already turned back to her fire, the conversation apparently complete on her end. I stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling something flutter uncertainly in my chest. Something I chose, for the time being, to file alongside the other things I was not ready to examine. Roman appeared around the side of the cottage, leading the roan, his plain cloak thrown back from his shoulders, his dark braids loose in the morning wind. He looked better than he had 2 days ago, still marked by what had been done to him, still carrying that careful control in every movement, but steadier. More himself, whatever that meant when the self in question was a Lycan king, standing in a muddy village courtyard, as though it were a throne room. He looked at me standing in the doorway. "Ready?" he asked. I pulled my gray cloak around me and stepped out into the cold morning. "North March," I said. "Lord Aldrich." "North March," he agreed. And we rode. Lord Aldrich's keep sat at the foot of the Grey Vale Mountains like a man who had decided long ago that he was not going to be moved. It was nothing like Vaelthorn Castle. No towers reaching for consequence, no banners designed to be seen from a distance and inspire the appropriate emotions. Just thick gray stone, low and broad and patient, built by someone who understood that the north wind does not care about architecture. The road to it had taken us through 2 days of increasingly thin forest and increasingly cold air, the kind of cold that settles into the lungs and reminds you that winter up here is not a season so much as a permanent negotiation. We had ridden hard and spoken little, and I had learned something about Roman in those 2 days of riding that I could not have learned in conversation. That he moved through difficult terrain, the way he moved through everything, without complaint, with complete attention, adapting to each change in the road, with a quiet fluency that suggested a man who had spent a great deal of his life in motion and had made peace with it. I, who had spent most of my life in castle corridors and Marin's workroom, had not made the same peace. By the end of the first day, my back ached in ways I did not have adequate language for, and I was fairly certain my pride was the only thing keeping me upright in the saddle. Roman had noticed. I could tell because he had begun with elaborate casualness, to choose the smoother paths when the road forked, and to slow the roan's pace in the rougher stretches without ever remarking on why. I did not thank him for it. We had developed, without discussing it, a language of small dignities, things done and received without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have required one of us to admit that the other was being cared for, and neither of us was quite ready for that. The gate guard at Aldrich's Keep looked at us with the professional suspicion of a man who had been stationed at a cold gate for several hours and was not inclined toward generosity. We looked. I was aware, like exactly nothing, a large man in a plain servant's cloak and a small woman in gray wool, arriving on a single horse with no escort and no visible credentials. "We require an audience with Lord Aldrich," Roman said. His voice had shifted almost imperceptibly from how it sounded in Corva's cottage. The same voice, but with something added to it, or rather something unsheathed from beneath the ordinary. The authority of it was not loud. It didn't need to be. The guard's eyes moved to Roman's face, then stayed there. "Your name," the guard said, but with less certainty than he'd had a moment before. "Tell him," Roman said, "that the wolf has returned from the deep." We were brought inside. Aldrich himself appeared within minutes, a lean man of perhaps 60 winters, with a close-cropped white beard and the kind of posture that speaks of a lifetime spent in armor. He stopped in the doorway of his great hall and looked at Roman for a long moment with an expression that moved through several stages too quickly for me to catalog all of them. What settled at the end was something that looked, on a man clearly unaccustomed to it, remarkably like relief. "My king," he said, and bent his knee. Roman crossed the room and put a hand on the old lord's shoulder, drawing him upright. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Not until this is finished. But I am alive, Aldrich. Whatever they told you, I am alive." What followed was 2 hours in Aldrich's council room. A room that smelled of old parchment and tallow, and the faint mineral sharpness of the mountain air that seeped through every window no matter how tightly the shutters were drawn. Roman laid out everything with the same precision he had used on Corva's parchment, and Aldrich listened with the focused attention of a man who understands that the quality of his listening in this moment will determine a great deal of what happens next. I sat at the edge of the room near the window and watched. Aldrich had a captain, a beta woman named Sarah, broad-shouldered and sharp-featured, with cropped dark hair and a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her jaw. She stood beside Aldrich and watched Roman with a soldier's evaluating eye. And somewhere in the second hour, she began asking questions of her own. Good questions. The kind that cut to logistics and timing, and the specific mechanics of what reclaiming Vaelthorn Castle would require. Roman answered each one directly, without embellishment. At one point he said, "The eastern garrison is Fenwick's, 300 swords. We cannot go through them. We need to go around, and we need to move before Cad realizes I'm not where he left me." "He'll know by now," Sarah said flatly. "Word travels. He'll have sent riders the moment the cell was found empty." Then we have less time than I'd like and more need for speed than is comfortable. Roman's eyes moved briefly to me. It was quick, a glance, nothing more. But Aldrich caught it, and I saw the old lord's eyes follow that glance with quiet attention. "How did you get out?" Aldrich asked. Roman was quiet for a moment. "Ellie," he said, "just my name, as though it were an answer in itself." Aldrich looked at me. Sarah looked at me. I looked back at them both and said nothing, because there was nothing to add that Roman had not already encompassed in that single word. Aldrich had 80 men. 80 was not 300. But Sarah pointed out, with the calm pragmatism of someone who had clearly spent considerable time solving problems with inadequate resources, that Fenwick's 300 were stationed at the eastern garrison, which was a full day's ride from Vaelthorn Castle. If they moved quickly enough, they could reach the castle before Fenwick's men could be recalled. The castle's internal guard, the men who answered directly to the crown rather than to any lord, numbered 40. The question was where their loyalty sat now that the crown appeared to be vacant. "There's a man named Bram," I said, and several heads turned toward me. I kept my voice level. "He served the castle for 40 years. He let me into the dungeon." He looked away from the keys. I paused. "He did not do that, because he supports Lord Cad." Sarah's sharp eyes moved to Roman. "A contact inside?" "A possibility," Roman said. He was looking at me, and there was something in his expression that I was becoming, slowly and somewhat unwillingly, able to read. A particular quality of attention that he gave to things he considered important. Ellie would need to make contact before we arrive. Alone. Ahead of the main party. The room went quiet in a particular way. "That's a considerable risk," Aldrich said carefully. "I know the castle," I said. "I know the passages. I know how to move through it without being seen." I met Roman's eyes. "I've already done it once. If Cade's men recognize you—" "Omegas are invisible," I said. "That has always been the assumption. I am choosing for once to use it." Another silence. Sarah made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been the sound a soldier makes when they recognize an argument they cannot effectively counter. Roman held my gaze for a long moment. The gray of his eyes in the candlelight of Aldrich's council room was darker than it had been in the dungeon. Storm color. The shade that comes just after a decision is made rather than just before. "You come back," he said. "Not a request. Not quite an order. Something between them. With an edge I felt rather than heard." "I intend to," I said. I left before dawn, riding a smaller horse that Aldrich's stablemaster provided. A steady gray mare who moved quietly and did not object to the cold. The plan was simple, in the way that only very dangerous things are simple. I would arrive at the castle before Roman's party, find Bram, convey what was coming, and ensure that when Roman arrived at the gates, the internal guard knew whose side they were on. Simple. I told myself this for the entire first hour of riding, and it helped less and less as the dark gave way to the gray pre-dawn light, and the shape of Vaelthorn Castle rose on the horizon. The castle looked different from the outside. It always surprised me, how large it was, how complete in itself, how entirely indifferent to the smallness of the people who moved through it. The Vaelthorn wolf banner still flew above the gate. Cade had not yet been bold enough to replace it, which told me something about the state of his confidence. I approached from the west, through the lower village that clustered outside the castle walls, and let myself be absorbed into the morning movement of servants and traders, and the ordinary commerce of a castle waking up. A woman in a gray cloak with a basket on one arm is nothing. She is furniture. She is part of the background of the world, and no one who matters looks at her directly. I found Bram at the well in the inner yard, drawing water for the morning watch's horses. Not his usual post, which told me he had been moved, which told me Ked's people were reorganizing. He looked up when I appeared at his elbow, and his face did something careful and controlled. You, he said very quietly. He's alive, I said, equally quiet. He's coming, today, before midday, if the road holds. Bram set down the bucket. He looked at the water in it for a moment, then at the gate, then at me. The inner guard, he said. Half of them are Cades now. The other half are waiting to see which way the wind blows. Tell them the wind is blowing north, I said. Tell them the wolf is on the road. Bram picked up his bucket. He did not look at me again. But as he walked away, he said, barely above a murmur, the west gate. Tell him the west gate will be open. I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. I was crossing back through the inner yard, hood pulled close, moving with the particular practiced invisibility of someone who has spent years perfecting it, when a hand closed around my arm. I went very still. The man who held me was one I didn't recognize, not castle guard, not servant. The kind of man who appears in the retinue of lords like Kaed, and doesn't have a title, but serves a clear function. He was looking at me with the specific attention that I had just told Roman Omegas never received. Lord Cade wants to speak with the girl, he said, who was seen in the lower passages 3 nights ago. The cold that moved through me then was not the mountain kind. It was the kind that comes when you realize that the one flaw in invisibility is that it only works until someone decides to look. Lord Cad's receiving chamber smelled of burnt candles and ambition. It was a room that had belonged to the castle steward until recently. I knew this because I had been in it before, carrying remedies for old Steward Pell's gout, and it had smelled then of dust and ledgers and the particular exhaustion of a man who managed too many things for too little recognition. Now it smelled of Kaed, expensive candles, fur-trimmed everything, the slightly overheated quality of a space occupied by someone who has decided they deserve more warmth than others. He was seated at the steward's old table as though it were a throne, which told me everything I needed to know about what he thought was happening. Lord Cad was not a large man, which I had always found significant. He had the narrow, precise build of someone who had compensated for physical smallness with an exhaustive cultivation of other kinds of power: political, financial, informational. His hair was dark and carefully oiled, his robes immaculate. He looked at me the way certain men look at things they consider minor obstacles, with mild irritation and complete confidence in their ability to remove them. The Omega Healer's girl, he said. Not unfriendly. That was somehow worse than unfriendly. Sit down. I sat, because refusing would have told him something he didn't need to know yet. The man who had brought me, broad, quiet, watchful, stationed himself behind my chair. You were seen, Cade said, entering the lower passage 3 nights ago, coming back up, alone. He folded his hands on the table. And this morning you are here again, moving through the inner yard, when I was told you had not been seen in the castle since. A pause, precisely waited. Where have you been, girl? The word girl landed the way he intended it to, as a reminder of dimension, of scale, of the vast and obvious difference between what he was and what I was. I had heard that word used that way my entire life, and I had learned over time that the correct response to it was not anger but stillness. Anger reveals what you're protecting. Stillness reveals nothing. I was frightened, I said. I let my voice be smaller than it actually was. Let my hands clasp in my lap the way hands clasp when they are nervous, because they were nervous. But there is a difference between being nervous and showing it in a way that someone can use. I went into the lower passage because I heard the other servants saying the king was unwell, and I thought perhaps I could help. With a remedy. I looked down. But the guard stopped me before I reached the cell. I left. I was frightened of being caught and went to stay with a cousin in the lower village. Silence. I kept my eyes low and let the silence do its work. Because silence after a lie is the most dangerous moment, and the correct response to it is to simply not fill it. "Which guard stopped you?" Cade asked. "I don't know his name," I said. "An older man, gray hair." Cade looked at the man behind my chair. Something passed between them that I felt rather than saw. A shift in attention. A weighing. Then Cade leaned back. "The king," he said pleasantly, "died in the night. A great sadness. The council will convene this afternoon to discuss the succession." I made my face to grief. It was not entirely performance. There was something genuinely sickening about hearing it said so cleanly, so arranged, as though a man's life were a ledger entry being closed. "I'm very sorry, my lord," I said. "Yes." He studied me for a moment longer. "You may go, but stay within the castle walls today. There will be arrangements, and we need all staff present." I rose, curtsied with the appropriate degree of deference, and walked to the door. I did not run. Running was for people who had something to hide, and I was a servant girl with a remedy basket and a story about a cousin, and there was nothing remarkable about me whatsoever. I made it to the corridor. I made it to the inner yard, and then I moved very quickly toward the west gate, because I had perhaps 1 hour before Cade's confidence became either confirmation or crisis, and Roman needed to know that the timing had collapsed. Bram was at the west gate. He took one look at my face and said nothing, only opened the smaller door set into the gate's frame, the one used for single persons, that could be opened and closed without the noise and mechanism of the full gate. I slipped through it and ran. The road west was empty in the cold morning air, the frost still white on the grass at its edges, the sky above a pale and serious gray. I ran until my lungs burned and my cloak streamed behind me, and then I saw them. A dark shape resolving out of the distance into horses, into riders, into the controlled forward motion of 80 men moving with purpose. Roman saw me before I reached them. He broke from the front of the column at a pace that covered the distance between us with startling speed, pulling the roan up short and swinging down before the horse had fully stopped, and then he was in front of me, and his hands were on my shoulders, and his eyes were moving over my face with an intensity that had nothing measured about it. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. A demand, and underneath it something raw that I had not heard from him before. "Cade had me brought to him," I said, still catching my breath. "I talked my way out, but he's moving faster than we thought. He's calling the council this afternoon. Succession." I met his eyes. "Bram will open the west gate. But it needs to be now, Roman. It needs to be right now." Something shifted in his expression at his name in my mouth. I had not called him that before, not directly, and I saw him register it, file it somewhere, let it settle without remark. He turned back to the column. "Sarah." She was already riding forward. I heard. "West gate. We move." What happened next, I experienced in fragments. The way the mind processes things that move faster than it can fully absorb. The west gate opening. Bram's gray head visible for a moment in the gap, and then the controlled flood of Aldrich's men through it, quiet and organized, and nothing like the chaos I had feared. The inner yard, the castle's own guard, 30 of them, formed up in 2 lines, and the moment of terrible suspension before the man at their head, a beta captain I knew by sight named Oswin, looked at Roman and went to one knee, and the men behind him followed like a wave finding the shore. The sound that moved through the castle then, not shouting, not the clash of open battle, but the particular acoustic of a large stone structure rearranging its understanding of who was in charge. Doors, boots on flagstone. Voices pitched low and urgent. Cade was found in his borrowed chamber, still seated at the steward's table, with 2 of his men beside him who made the correct calculation very quickly when they saw what had arrived in the doorway. Cade himself did not make any calculation at all for a long moment. He simply stared at Roman with the expression of a man whose entire architecture of belief has collapsed simultaneously, and who has not yet processed what he is standing in the rubble of. "You," he said. "Me? Roman agreed. Lord Fenwick's riders arrived at the eastern gate 6 hours later to find it closed, and the Vaelthorn wolf flying above walls that were already, definitively, no longer theirs to negotiate with. The council convened 3 days later in the Great Hall, with all its members present, including Lady Voss, who had arrived the second day with her own retinue and an expression of profound relief barely contained beneath her formal composure. Cade and Fenwick faced the consequences of what they had built, and those consequences were administered with the measured severity of a king who understood that justice performed publicly is also a message sent broadly. I was not in the Great Hall for the council. I was in Marin's workroom, where Marin herself, recovered from her illness and fully informed of everything that had happened, in a conversation that had lasted 2 hours and left her alternately horrified and fiercely proud, was directing me to reorganize the remedy stores with the comfortable tyranny of a woman who shows love through assignment of tasks. I did not mind. The workroom was warm and familiar, and smelled of everything I had always found steadying, and after the past week it felt extraordinary to have ordinary things to do with my hands. I was sorting dried yarrow when the door opened. I knew it was him before I turned around. I had learned, without meaning to, the particular quality of space that changed when Roman entered a room. Not loudness, not dominance exactly, but a kind of atmospheric shift, as though the air made adjustments. Marin looked up, looked at Roman, looked at me, and announced that she needed something from the cellar. She left with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman making a decision about where to be. Roman crossed the room and stopped on the other side of the work table. He was dressed properly now. Dark leather, the crossed harness across his chest, the wolf head clasp at his shoulder that marked his rank. He looked like what he was, and yet I found, somewhat to my own confusion, that he did not look more unfamiliar for it, just more complete. He set something on the table between us. It was a small folded document, sealed with the Vaelthorn wolf in dark wax. I looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "A formal appointment," he said. "Head of the Healing Guild at Vaelthorn Castle. Your own workroom. Your own authority over the castle's medical care, independent of rank hierarchy. Answerable to the crown directly and to no one else." I stared at the document for a long moment. Something moved in my chest, complicated and warm and slightly overwhelming. "Roman, it is not," he said, and his voice was careful in a way I recognized as the particular care he used when something mattered. "A reward for what you did. It is a recognition of what you are. There is a difference." I looked up at him. Those gray eyes, steady and direct and carrying, as they always did, more than the surface of them showed. "There will be people who object," I said. "An Omega holding independent authority." "Yes," he said. "There will be people who object. I find I am not concerned about them." The silence that settled between us then was different from all the silences before. Not the silence of a dungeon, not the silence of a forest road, not the silence of a strategy room. This was the silence of two people standing in an ordinary room made extraordinary by what had accumulated between them, neither quite willing to be the first to step into it fully, and both completely aware that they were going to. "I would like you to stay," he said finally. Simply. "Not in the dungeon, not as a fugitive on a road. Here, at Vaelthorn, where I can—" A pause, and in the pause I heard everything he was not yet saying, the vast and careful architecture of it. "Where you can do the work you are meant to do." I thought about the dungeon, the cold, the chains, the question he had asked me in the dark, why, and the answer I had given him, and how completely I had meant it. I thought about Corva's cottage, and the map drawn in charcoal, and 2 days on a cold road with a man who chose the smoother path without saying why. I thought about the great hall where I had once stood invisible at the edge of everything, and watched a world that had no place for me in it, and how it had not occurred to me then that the world could be changed. Only navigated. I picked up the sealed document from the table. "I'll need proper herb stores," I said. "The current cellar is poorly organized and half the dried stock is past its usefulness." Something happened to Roman's face then. Slow and genuine and entirely unguarded. The kind of expression that arrives when relief and something warmer than relief meet in the same moment. "I'll have the cellar master answer to you directly," he said. "Good," I said. He reached across the table. Not for the document. His hand settled over mine, briefly. Warm, certain, saying without words what both of us understood would take time to say fully and properly, time that we now, against considerable odds, actually had. Then he straightened and turned toward the door and paused. "Ellie." "Yes?" "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving me in the dark." I looked at the sealed document in my hands, at the wolf pressed in dark wax, at the ordinary miracle of a thing that bore my name and the weight of recognition I had never expected to hold. "You would have found your way out eventually," I said. "Perhaps," he said, "but not that night, and not to the same place." He left. I stood in the warm workroom that smelled of yarrow and rosemary and wood smoke, holding a document that meant I was no longer invisible unless I chose to be. And I listened to his footsteps move away down the corridor and up into the castle that was, improbably, irrevocably, beginning to feel like it had space in it for me. Marin reappeared in the doorway a few minutes later, looked at my face, and said nothing. She simply moved to her side of the work table and began sorting the herbs I had abandoned, her ink-stained hands moving with the brisk efficiency of long practice. After a moment she said, without looking up, "The yarrow goes on the left shelf. It always has." "I know," I said, and I went back to work. The council records of Vaelthorn would later note, in the careful script of whatever clerk was assigned to such things, that in the year of the wolf's return, a formal appointment was made, unprecedented in the kingdom's history, of an Omega woman to a position of independent authority within the royal castle. Those same records noted that the appointment was made by the Lycan King himself, and that it was never challenged. Not once. Not by anyone who valued their standing in that court. Lord Cad spent his remaining years in the northern exile that Roman's justice prescribed. A cold, quiet life, far from the corridors of power he had tried to seize. Lord Fenwick surrendered his garrison and his title both, and the eastern lands were redistributed to lords who understood the difference between loyalty and convenience. Lord Aldrich returned to his Greystone Keep in the North March, where Sarah continued to run the garrison with the calm efficiency that was her natural register. He sent a letter to Vaelthorn every season until his death, and Roman answered every one. Old Bram retired from the night watch the following spring, at Roman's quiet insistence, and was given a cottage within the castle walls, and a stipend that required nothing of him, but that he rest. He spent his remaining years in the inner garden, growing things, and greeted Ellie every morning when she passed on her way to the workroom, with the particular nod of a man who knows what he knows, and sees no need to elaborate. Marin lived another 12 years, sharp-minded to the end, and never once admitted to having orchestrated anything. Those who knew her considered this the most transparent lie she ever told. And Ellie, who had descended into a dark place on a cold night, with nothing but a clay pot of salve and the belief that no one should be left to disappear quietly, remained at Vaelthorn for the rest of her life. Not invisible, not at the edges, at the center of things, exactly where she had always belonged, in a world that had simply needed someone brave enough to rearrange it. She chose to stay. She had always been the kind of person who, given the choice, chose the harder and truer thing. That never changed.